Our last speaker in this session is Mr. Doron, Daniel Doron, who will talk about the other side of the US aid. He will talk in English.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Professor Inbar and colleagues, for inviting me to speak in this important conclave, which discusses such crucial issues. We owe the US a great debt of gratitude for all the help it has proffered to Israel politically and economically. From the state's establishment to date, US aid, economically and militarily, amounted to about $105 billion, a good sum of money, even if it amounted to less than half of Israel's current GNP, which is $235 billion. At its peak in 1985, aid was $3.8 billion, which represented 16% of Israel's GDP, a hefty proportion. It therefore played a significant role then in how the Israeli economy developed, in shaping its structure in a way that still influences the economy to this day, and not always for the better. In 2007, Israel stopped receiving economic aid and was given only military assistance, around $3 billion a year. Military aid represents today only 1% of Israel's GDP, a burden Israel could conceivably carry by itself. It may be important, however, to maintain the aid relationship for other strategic, political, and institutional reasons, since it involves Israel more intimately with many important American sectors, not least its defense industry. Our friend Mr. Halperin gave a wonderful rundown about this relationship. But no relationship is perfect. Experience suggests that there is room for improvement even in the best relationships, even between best friends. As the great development economist Lord Peter Bauer observed a decade ago, foreign aid, which America gave Israel so generously, can also pose some very tough challenges, indeed aggravate some very thorny problems for countries that try to rely on it for enhanced and enduring development. This is also true for countries who receive only military aid, as is the case with Israel, who stopped receiving economic assistance from the US in 2007. Funds are fungible. Even when a country is a beneficiary of military aid alone, such aid enables its government to use resources it would otherwise have to allocate for military use for other purposes. The major problem with foreign aid is simply that it is necessarily funneled through governments. Governments naturally operate according to political constraints rather than economic considerations. Indeed, they often operate politically in ways that damage the economy rather than assist it. Governments create wasteful public sectors designed ostensibly to enhance the welfare of their citizens, the so-called welfare state. In reality, politicians often exploit citizens' predicament of the poor as an excuse for building a wider and wider public sector and interlocking bureaucracies that literally choke the economy while granting politicians the power to provide supporters with jobs and resources. All of this at the expense of the needy class, which is harmed for the sake of political gain. Governments often, as in Israel, is the greatest employer and the purchaser in the economy. It therefore also tends to favor big business through the sheer size of its operation, and of course, through its never-ending thicket of regulation. This results in a great concentration of economic power in the private sector, huge monopolies and cartels. They progressively come to dominate economic activity at the expense of smaller businesses that cannot afford the business imposed by government, the expenses and the burdens imposed by government. So the bigger the government, the bigger the damage to small businesses, which are the chief engines of innovation and growth in every economy. Lord Bauer has demonstrated with ample proof how disastrous foreign aid proved to be for many African and Muslim countries. the flow of a great amount of money in foreign aid through their governments badly aggravated an inherent weakness in these economies resulting from their authoritarian government structure. It resulted in ever-growing concentration of economic activity in the hands of a few institutions and tycoons with strong political ties. Indeed, in many of these countries, as is clearly the case in Egypt, former government bureaucrats and even top military men have become major economic players with all the power that this implies. In Egypt, the army is in control of a full third of the economy, not the most efficient or productive way to run a modern economy. An inefficient government-dominated economy is responsible for the exceedingly high rate of unemployment, reaching 30%, especially among the young. Remember the massive impoverishment that this leads to and its disastrous political consequences. The Arab Spring, many people have not paid enough attention, was mostly dominated by economic impoverishment. These are the bitter facts of political life. They are too often ignored by those whose narrow view of politics exclude economic processes that affect politics in a major way. In the past, such blindness to economics development was responsible for the failure of many of the experts on the Soviet Union to predict its sudden collapse. Today, it is responsible for the failure to realize how weak the Iranian regime is economically, how dependent it is on current exports of oil to feed 60 million of its citizens, and how relatively easy it can be to bring it to its knees by effectively hurting its oil imports without even touching its nuclear facilities. Israel cannot be compared, of course, to destitute African states, certainly not to an economically dysfunctional Egypt. Israel is rightly known as a startup nation. It boasts a vigorous and innovative high-tech sector that is a true marvel. Also, Israel has weathered the post-2008 economic troubles far better than other nations. However, a closer examination of the Israeli economy reveals some very worrisome failures. Despite arguably the best human capital in the world, tiny Israel has more startups than all of Europe. And despite over $300 billion invested from foreign sources, the Israeli economy pays its capable workers a pitiful wage of about $2,200 a month. This, when prices of most consumer goods and services in Israel are higher than in the United States. Small wonder that millions of Israeli workers are struggling to make ends meet. In April 2010, Bank of Israel study has analyzed the problem of excessive concentration in the Israeli economy and alerted us to the danger it poses to the stability and even viability of the Israeli economy. It noted, quote, that some 20 business groups, nearly all of family nature and structured in a pronounced pyramid form, continue to control a large proportion of public firms, some 25% of firms listed for trading, and about half of the market share. In addition, the same groups receive most of the credit given by the banks to the business community and 60% of the non-banking credit. These business groups, the bank's report warned, show higher levels of financial leverage and therefore also of risk than standalone company. Nevertheless, we hear people here who are in deep denial and try to deny that such a problem exists, despite the fact of the high dysfunction of the Israeli economy and its roots. These pyramid-style conglomerates dominated so much of the Israeli economy, as well as the two major banks became too large to fail. The possibility of their failure, which was tested in the past and may be tested again any day now, is just too horrific, so damaging to the total economy that everything possible must be done to prevent it. And this gives them leeway to continue with their damaging practices. This is the struggle we are engaged in now in Israel. But what all this has to do with foreign aid and with the economic interaction between the United States and Israel. What has sown the seeds of this extraordinary concentration of economic and political power in Israel is no doubt Israel's socialist past. Even after the demise of socialism in the late 70s, concentration did not only diminish, it actually grew, as the statist ideology and practice continued to dominate Israeli life in Israel, and extensive government intervention was justified not on socialist ground, but on nationalist one. The initial dominance of the government, namely of politics over the economy, after the creation of the state and the great concentration of economic and political power that was later maintained, was the result of government consuming over 80% of the gross national product and 19% of all savings, so that most assets were concentrated in the hands of in government hands and in the hands of the political ally and infrastructure, the Labor Federation, the Histadrut. Foreign remittances played a significant part in enabling these processes. Government still plays a major role in the economy, even now when its share in the GNP has shrunk to close to 50%. And after most of the assets that belong to government and the Histadrut were sold in a phony privatization process to cronies, to some dozen families who brought everything inside with loans taken from their allies in the bureaucracy, who became the managers of the nationalist banks. There was no privatization, Mr. Don't kid yourself. It was all a sham. True, government no longer controls 90% of all credit, as in the early decades of the state, but credit is still heavily misallocated in favor of big business in Israel. It is a major factor in the dysfunction of the Israeli economy and its domination by inefficient and rapacious conglomerates, banks, and insurance companies, many of them managed by former high government bureaucrats with very questionable business skills and ethics. See the low rate of return on capital of these businesses and the exceedingly high rate of non-performing debt in the portfolios of these banks. Also consider the very low return Israeli pension funds receive on their immense, and it turns out very risky, investments in these conglomerates. Witness the rapacious behavior, the inflated salaries they allocate themselves for their poor business performance, and the high monopoly rents they shamelessly exact from the poorest strata in Israel. In the Mona, prices of most goods are higher than in Tel Aviv because of the behavior of these people. For their poor business performance, which they make up by plundering the poor with monopoly rates, these banks and conglomerates owners and insurance companies and managers allot themselves astronomical salaries and bonuses in the hundreds of millions. In no country, competitive country, would such a situation be tolerated. The misallocation of credit and its concentration in big business is also a chief reason why the Negev and the Galilee, Israel's so-called periphery, a mere 100 miles from the center, are suffering from prolonged and severe credit crunch. It does not enable the small and medium companies that are based there to take off and develop. The great economic clout these conglomerates wield also enables them and their monopolies to erect a thicket of entry barriers and keep would-be competitors out with the aid of government-imposed protective tariffs to control the control of shelf space in supermarkets. To talk of a free market in Israel is a joke. There ain't such a thing. Lack of competition combined with so-called progressive labor laws that negatively affect labor flexibility have resulted in low efficiency and in the low per capita productivity of the Israeli worker, about half of that of the US. You know, everybody talks about the Haredim and about Arabs, and the lack of participation in the workforce. Nobody speaks about the fact that if we increase the productivity of Israelis that do work by 10%, 15%, it would raise our GNP far greater amount than obsessing ourselves with the Haredim with not slight anti-Semitic tones to it. So yes, our socialist and statist heritage bred our distorted, inefficient, heavily concentrated, highly politicized system is the major reason for our predicament. But foreign aid, in fact, foreign remittances generally were serious enablers of this misfortune. This need not be so. As a young man, I was delegated by the Prime Minister's office, then directed by the legendary Teddy Kollek, to co-manage a special $6 million fund. It would be equivalent to about 60 these days, I suppose. The funds were allocated by US Congress for 42 projects in Israel. As could be expected, the projects were selected with political goals in mind and reflected complex political realities in both nations. I shall not regale you with the details, but I'll say that from the microcosm of this one fund, you could learn the whole range of problems that politically motivated foreign aid necessarily creates. Perhaps a good way to minimize the problematic nature of aid and to maximize its benefits is for those granting aid to take full account not only of its economic but also of its political ramifications, of the fact that aid is necessarily dispensed through government, and to devise checks and balances that would neutralize some of its unwelcome consequences. Why not assist the recipient country to benefit from American experience in creating fair market practices, its antitrust activities, its making sure that financial markets are transparent and equitable, that small businesses are not barred from the marketplace by large conglomerates. In short, that American aid does not become complicit in unfair practices that favor politically connected enterprises, as it often does. This is not a call for nation building, heaven forfend, but for preventing government-to-government aid from tilting the economic and social playing field in the recipient countries too much in favor of government, the public sector, and big business, in a manner that will render foreign aid ineffective and even counterproductive. This is not a simple challenge, but if you want to ascertain that foreign aid is indeed a help rather than a hindrance to a recipient country's development, if we do not want American aid to weaken its allies, as it arguably often does, it is a challenge we should eagerly embrace. Thank you.